There is something about growing up in America as Generation X that people who lived it instantly recognize but struggle to explain. It was a childhood balance between freedom and neglect, optimism and anxiety, analog living and digital beginnings. If you were born between the mid-1960s and the early 1980s, you didn't grow up protected by constant supervision or overwhelmed by screens. You grew up figuring things out on your own. You grew up when adults trusted kids to disappear for hours, when mistakes were part of learning, and when the world felt both dangerous and full of possibility. This was the generation that learned independence early, skepticism naturally, and resilience by necessity. Generation X didn't inherit a perfect world. They inherited a complicated one and learned how to navigate it quietly. This was the generation that came home to empty houses, let themselves in with a key around their neck, poured cereal, and turned on the television. The generation that watched the Cold War unfold in the background, practiced nuclear drills in school, and still rode bikes until the streetlights came on. They were the first kids raised by widespread divorce, the first to grow up with both parents working full-time, and the last to remember life before the internet changed everything. Let's walk through what it actually felt like to grow up Generation X in America. Some of this will bring back memories instantly. Some of it will explain why this generation turned out the way it did. Let's step into that world. Gen X childhood in America was defined by independence. Parents didn't hover. In many households, both parents worked and kids were expected to manage themselves. The term latchkey kid wasn't an insult. It was normal. Kids walked home from school alone, sometimes miles, let themselves inside and handled the hours before dinner on their own. There were no check-in texts and no location tracking. Parents trusted that their kids would figure it out, and mostly they did. Neighborhoods were filled with kids roaming freely. Bikes were transportation, not toys. Kids rode without helmets, and they explored construction sites, empty lots, drainage ditches, and woods. You learned boundaries the hard way. You scraped knees, broke bones, got into trouble, and learned from it. Parents expected kids to work things out among themselves. Telling an adult was discouraged. You learned conflict resolution early because there was no referee. Homes in the 1970s and 1980s reflected practicality more than perfection. Furniture was sturdy. Living rooms had brown or floral sofas that could survive abuse. Televisions were heavy pieces of furniture, often sitting on the floor or in large wooden cabinets. Remote controls did not become common until the 1980s, and even then, someone still had to get up to adjust the antenna. Kitchens were functional. Microwaves slowly became standard, changing how families ate. Frozen dinners, pizza rolls, and instant meals became staples for kids who were home alone. The television became a silent companion for Generation X. Afternoons were filled with syndicated reruns, cartoons, and game shows. Saturday morning cartoons were sacred. Shows like He-Man, Transformers, G.I. Joe, and Scooby-Doo defined childhood. These weren't just entertainment. They were shared experiences. Every kid watched the same shows at the same time. Missing an episode meant being left out of conversations at school. By the early 1980s, cable television began expanding rapidly. This changed everything. Channels multiplied. In 1981, a new channel launched that would shape an entire generation's identity: MTV. Music videos played 24 hours a day, blending sound and image into something entirely new. For Gen X teens, MTV was not just TV, it was culture. It told people what was cool, what mattered, and what the future looked like. Music became visual, fashion became global, and youth culture accelerated overnight. Music itself was central to Gen X identity. This generation grew up as rock evolved into new forms. Classic rock played alongside punk, new wave, hip-hop, and early alternative. Kids made mixtapes on cassette tapes, carefully recording songs off the radio, timing the pause button perfectly to avoid disc jockeys talking over intros. Music was not disposable. You listened to entire albums, read liner notes, and memorized lyrics. Your taste in music was part of who you were. The Walkman changed everything. Suddenly, music was personal and portable. You could soundtrack your own life. Riding the bus with headphones on became an emotional escape. This was the beginning of internal worlds, private identities forming alongside public lives. Before we continue deeper into Gen X culture, if you are enjoying this look back at how Americans really grew up and you want more stories like this, consider subscribing. There are so many untold chapters of everyday history that shape the world we live in now. School for Generation X kids was strict but straightforward. Teachers were authority figures. Detention was common. Corporal punishment still existed in some regions. Schools emphasized discipline, memorization, and conformity. There was less focus on self-esteem and more on results. You passed or failed. You adapted or struggled. Schools also served as places where major cultural shifts quietly played out. Integration, changing gender roles, and evolving expectations were happening in real time. The Cold War loomed constantly in the background. Kids practiced duck and cover drills long after the strategy made sense. Nuclear war felt possible. Movies like The Day After terrified families. News broadcasts talked about missiles, communism, and global tension. Gen X grew up with a low-level anxiety baked into daily life. The world didn't feel stable, and adults didn't pretend that it was. In the 1980s, politics became louder. The election of Ronald Reagan reshaped American culture. Patriotism surged. Military imagery returned to pop culture. Movies glorified strength and individualism. At the same time, economic inequality grew. Some families thrived, others struggled. Generation X noticed these contradictions early. They became skeptical of slogans and suspicious of institutions. Technology began entering everyday life, but slowly. Video games arrived in arcades first. These dark, noisy spaces were social hubs for kids and teens. Games like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and Space Invaders required quarters and skill. Arcades were competitive, communal, and thrilling. Then came home consoles. The Nintendo Entertainment System changed childhood forever. Super Mario Bros. Was not just a game, it was a shared obsession. Kids spent hours mastering levels, passing controllers back and forth, and arguing over turns. Video games became a permanent part of childhood, but they had not yet replaced outdoor play. They simply joined it. Shopping malls were the center of teenage life. The mall wasn't just a place to buy things. It was where you went to see and be seen. Food courts, record stores, arcades, and movie theaters made malls self-contained social worlds. This freedom shaped social skills, independence, and identity. Mall culture defined Generation X adolescence. Movies played a huge role in shaping Gen X worldview. Hollywood began targeting teens directly. Films like The Breakfast Club, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off spoke directly to young people. These movies treated teenagers as complex individuals, not children. They acknowledged boredom, rebellion, and alienation. Gen X finally saw themselves reflected honestly on screen. But Gen X also experienced trauma together. In 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster happened live on television. Schools rolled television sets into classrooms. Students watched as the shuttle exploded, killing everyone aboard, including a teacher. For many Gen Xers, This was the moment innocence ended. Technology was not always safe. Authority figures did not always have control. Disaster could happen instantly. Family structures changed dramatically during Gen X childhood. Divorce rates rose sharply, and blended families became common. Kids learned adaptability early. They moved between households, navigated complicated family dynamics, and often took on emotional responsibilities beyond their years. This contributed to Gen X's reputation for self-reliance and emotional restraint. Fashion reflected rebellion and experimentation. Styles changed quickly, from bell-bottoms to skinny ties, neon colors to black leather. Generation X used clothing to express identity. Trends were adopted, discarded, and reinvented constantly. There was no social media to archive mistakes. If you looked ridiculous, it existed only in memory. The 1990s marked Gen X's transition into adulthood. Just as they came of age, the economy shifted again. Jobs became less stable. Loyalty between employers and employees weakened. Gen X entered a workforce that no longer promised pensions or lifelong security. This reinforced their skepticism. They learned to rely on themselves rather than institutions. What defined growing up Gen X in America was balance. Freedom without guidance. Opportunity without guarantees. Connection without constant communication. This generation learned resilience not through motivational speeches, but through experience. They learned how to be alone, how to adapt, how to question narratives, and how to survive uncertainty. Gen X didn't demand attention. They didn't expect praise. They watched the world change around them and adjusted quietly. They became the bridge between analog and digital, between post-war optimism and modern complexity. They grew up when the world felt both larger and more fragile, and they carried those lessons forward. For those who lived it, growing up Gen X wasn't easy, but it was formative. It created a generation that values authenticity, independence, and realism. A generation shaped not by perfection, but by survival. And for those with memories of this era, there is always more history to uncover.